Recently, the United States launched Operation Epic Fury, sending B-2 stealth bombers to drop thousands of munitions on Iranian targets in a massive, coordinated strike designed to eliminate top leadership. By any conventional military logic, taking 1,000 precision strikes in 24 hours shatters a nation's ability to fight back. But Iran absorbed the impact and immediately launched a highly coordinated asymmetric counteroffensive. They survive through extreme financial asymmetry. A single Iranian Shahed drone costs around $20,000, but it can destroy American radar systems worth hundreds of millions. By firing these cheap, mass-produced weapons in bulk, Iran forces the U.S. to burn through defensive interceptors that cost millions of dollars apiece. And when the U.S. tried to cut off the head of the military, they triggered what is known as the Mosaic Doctrine. Iran's military structure is divided into 31 autonomous provinces. If Central Command in Tehran goes dark, 31 local commanders immediately take full, independent control of their regions. America is trying to fight a traditional war against an enemy that has engineered itself into a decentralized fortress. You cannot bomb a nation into submission when its entire structure is designed to function perfectly after the leadership is removed. And while the U.S. controls the skies, Iran controls something far more sensitive, the geography of global trade, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. Look at this map of the waterway. This pinch point is only about 20 miles wide, yet 20% of the total global oil supply flows through it every single day. It is also the primary route for 90% of the food imported by the neighboring Gulf countries. Iran doesn't need a massive naval fleet to close this route. They only need to strike 1 or 2 commercial vessels. Within hours, maritime insurance companies refuse to cover ships entering the area, and the global traffic simply stops on its own. Beyond the shipping lanes, Iran holds a second critical vulnerability over its neighbors. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE rely on exposed desalination plants to process ocean water into 60% of their drinking supply. A handful of cheap drones could wipe out these facilities, leaving millions of people without drinking water for months. Iran's true power comes from pointing a gun directly at the jugular of the global economy. It is a desperate, maximalist survival strategy, one born out of 70 years of historical paranoia and betrayal. To understand how we got here, we have to look back to 1951. Iran's elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, saw that Britain was extracting almost all the profit from Iran's massive oil reserves. He nationalized the oil fields, ensuring the wealth would stay with the Iranian people. The West retaliated immediately. Through a covert operation called Operation Ajax, the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated a coup, jailed Mossadegh, and installed the Shah, a monarch who happily handed oil influence back to the US and Britain, breeding a deep resentment among the Iranian public. 2 decades later, the global financial system fractured. In 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the US dollar would no longer be backed by gold. Without gold, the dollar desperately needed a new anchor to maintain its dominance. This flowchart illustrates the solution they found: the petrodollar. The U.S. approached Saudi Arabia with a deal. If OPEC countries agreed to sell their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars and reinvest that cash into the American economy, the U.S. would provide absolute military protection. This system cemented American financial hegemony across the globe. But from Iran's perspective, their democratic sovereignty was crushed simply because the United States required absolute control over Middle Eastern resources to protect its currency. That decades-long resentment finally boiled over. During the 1979 revolution, the Iranian people overthrew the Shah, swarmed the U.S. embassy, and violently expelled American influence from their borders. A year later, Iraq invaded Iran. Over an agonizing 8-year war, the United States provided tactical support to Saddam Hussein, even as Iraqi forces deployed chemical weapons against Iranian civilians. Iran pleaded with the United Nations for help, but the international community stayed silent. Realizing no one was coming to save them, Iranian leadership looked for a permanent shield. They turned to the nuclear technology the U.S. had originally gifted them years earlier, pushing to develop a deterrent so terrifying that no country would ever invade them again. The U.S. and Israel responded with a shadow war. They deployed the Stuxnet computer virus to physically shatter Iranian centrifuges, while leading nuclear scientists were assassinated in the streets of Tehran. Exhausted by a collapsing economy, Iran eventually compromised. In 2015, they signed the JCPOA nuclear peace deal, strictly limiting their enrichment in exchange for the removal of sanctions. But 3 years later, the U.S. walked away, tore up the agreement, and reinstated sanctions so severe that Iranian hospitals couldn't even import basic anesthesia. Iran endured a chemical war while the world looked away, and watched a superpower discard a binding peace treaty. For them, the lesson was absolute. Diplomacy is a trap, and a nuclear weapon is the only guarantee of existence. This satellite image shows one of Iran's sprawling nuclear facilities. After the treaties collapsed, Iran stopped negotiating. They moved their uranium enrichment operations deep underground and pushed purity levels up to 60%, edging dangerously close to weapons-grade material. To protect these sites, they weaponized their natural geography. The towering Zagros Mountains form an impenetrable shield along Iran's border. Beneath these peaks, they carved out subterranean missile cities and drone bases, rendering conventional airstrikes nearly useless. Instead of fighting on their own soil, they employ a strategy of forward defense. Iran funds, arms, and coordinates proxy militia groups across Yemen, Lebanon, and Palestine, pushing the violence far away from their own borders. And now, their retaliatory strikes on Gulf bases are testing the foundation of American financial power. If Iran proves that the U.S. military cannot protect Saudi Arabia and the UAE from cheap drone swarms, the core security guarantee that keeps global oil traded in U.S. dollars falls apart. You cannot defeat an ideology forged by 7 decades of trauma using precision bombs. Iran has deliberately wired its own survival. They are fully prepared to drag the global energy grid, the shipping lanes, and the international economy down into the dark with them.